to truly support actions at scale and to ensure that measures to support community-based adaptation are embedded in policy, legislative, planning and budgeting frameworks, and so can be sustained over the longer term, independently of donor or NGO support. So these are some of the things we're going to deal with. Now, I just want to put up these guide questions before we get to our panelists. These are the three sort of broad questions we're going to be dealing with, among some others. So first, what's the role of institutions in influencing socially differentiated outcomes of adaptation at the local level? Secondly, how do institutions articulate across scales, sort of upwards and downwards, to support community-based adaptation? And finally, what are some of the possible policy-level pathways for supporting CBA at scale? We haven't talked much about the specifics of what policy instruments and mechanisms would allow us to support CBA at the national level. With that, I'm going to stop. I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Robin Mearns from the World Bank, and I lead a program on the social dimensions of climate change. Our first speaker, let me shut this down. Okay, our first speaker is Professor Arun Agrawal. He's a faculty member in the School of Natural Resources and Environment at the University of Michigan, and he's been working with us in the Social Development Department over the past 3 years. His work deals with the political and institutional aspects of resource use and governance, and he's currently working on a book on poverty and adaptation. Arun, over to you.
Thank you, Robin. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I've heard of the community-based adaptation conferences for many years now, and to see a lot of people here whose names I'm familiar with, and to meet them is really quite thrilling and makes me happy. The title of the talk today is Local Organizations, Social Differentiation, and Climate Adaptation. And this talk is based on results of 2 different research projects, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. There are 2 parts to the talk. One focuses on what are the forms of adaptations that we see at the local level in the countries that we studied and in the villages that we did our fieldwork, and what accounts for the variation in different kinds of adaptations that we see at the local level. And the second part of the talk focuses on the lessons that the analysis of adaptation holds for forms of policy support and interventions to strengthen adaptations that local communities and households undertake. This just gives you a sense of where the countries are where we carried out our studies. All the countries are in the low-income tropics, and roughly, and the emphasis really here is on roughly, they have similar backgrounds and similar contextual conditions in terms of incomes, of households, assets, climate impacts-related vulnerability, and political conditions. The conclusions that I will present in the talk draw on evidence that we collected from these countries. In each country, we studied 4 villages, and the number of households that we selected for each country varied between 120 and 300. We collected data using the same, essentially more or less the same research instruments, and we carried out analysis. We are in the process of conducting analysis that would span all the 9 countries. Today, however, the results are on the basis of analysis of selected sets of countries. The 2 projects that supported this research are, one was called Area-Based Development and Climate Change, and the second was Costing Adaptations Through Local Institutions. The study focused in particular on local adaptations at the community level undertaken either by individual households or collectively by multiple households together. In this sense, the adaptations were shaped by the household characteristics in local contexts. rather than being regulated by some larger policies or sets of incentives or interventions to elicit similar responses from households. Nonetheless, we also start with the knowledge that even seemingly autonomous adaptations by households are shaped by perceived or non-obvious constraints, such as institutional structures or organizational relationships and access of households to different organizations. In this sense, all human actions, all human life is action under constraints, and responses to climate impacts are no exception. In fact, another name for adaptation could be structured choice. And the only question is, how much structure and how much choice? And that's really the part of the goal of the analysis. In addition to being choice under constraints, adaptation is also choice under uncertainty. Certainly, and perhaps fortunately, we don't know in any precise manner how climate impacts will unfold in specific locations or contexts. Even as adaptation always occurs inevitably in these same locations. As Robin said, adaptation is often seen as being local. The absence of precise information about how climate impacts will affect a given place or a given group of people means that attempts to support adaptation inevitably have to draw from past experiences, even as one recognizes that the future is unlikely to mimic the past. In examining observed adaptations, we attempt to link them with their general drivers in two dimensions. The first concerns different types of risks that climate impacts are likely to create for poor and, in fact, other households as well. And our initial starting point is to say that all local households and community-level adaptations are responses to four major forms of risks. The first is risk across, well, first just chronologically, risks across space. The second, risks over time. Third, risks across asset classes. And fourth, risks across households. The specific adaptive response to these four kinds of risks are mobility to overcome risks across space, storage to overcome risks over time, diversification to address risks across asset classes, and pooling to address risks across households. And you will say, well, you said four kinds of risks, but you have 5 different adaptations there. And market-based responses or market-based adaptations to risks are a very general response to different kinds of risks. When households and communities have access to markets, and markets have instruments that are bought and sold to address risks, then any of the other 4 types of risks can be addressed through market exchange. For example, think of crop insurance or weather-related insurance policies. A second way, we also classify different examples of adaptations we encountered in the field settings was by referencing them to sensitivity and adaptive capacity, 2 dimensions or 2 key dimensions of vulnerability, and whether these adaptations are undertaken individually or collectively. And this box just gives you a sense of how we classified different kinds of different examples of adaptations that we encountered in the field. And this slide gives you a sense of the bewildering variety of adaptations. I shouldn't say bewildering, but at least overwhelming variety of adaptation examples that we encountered in the field. And this list of adaptations that we put together is based on interviews with more than 1,000 households in the 9 countries that were studied. So how do we explain the different kinds of adaptations and the variety of adaptations that we encountered? And when one looks at the very large variety of adaptation, it is obvious that many different factors are likely to be at play and need to be considered when advancing explanations for the observed variety that we see in the field. And one key insight that we derive when trying to explain variations in adaptation is the idea that the starting point for explaining this variety has to be vulnerability and an analysis of vulnerability. But that such an sorry, I just wanted to give one more sentence. Yeah, and so our research tries to examine how adaptations selected by communities correlate with their different physical, social, economic, demographic, organizational, and informational characteristics. When explaining adaptation, we start with our starting point is the idea that adaptations need to be linked to vulnerability, but that this analysis must be linked to patterns of vulnerability, or what we call vulnerability profiles, rather than vulnerability indices. What do we mean by that? Vulnerability profiles are an attempt to understand the similar ways in which some groups are vulnerable in contrast to other ways in which other groups are vulnerable, even if they are vulnerable to the same extent. So in this sense, vulnerability profiles are an attempt to separate out the different characteristics of groups that make them vulnerable, rather than using vulnerability indices, which give you a sense of the levels of vulnerability, but not the different ways in which people are vulnerable. And this cobweb diagram gives you one quick snapshot of the different ways in which two groups that we talked about or that we met with are vulnerable. The first of these, the blue cobweb, is low education pastoralists, and the pink one is smallholder crop growers. And this one again gives you a sense of the very different ways in which Highlander smallholders and larger cash crop growers are vulnerable. So how do we begin to explain effective adaptations? And the first analysis that I want to present is based on the findings from country comparisons. And what we find... you're kidding me. Okay. Okay. What we find is that household characteristics and past experiences of hazards are key determinants of vulnerability. And in consonance with a lot of other work, we find that better off households invest more and have greater organizational access. And this numerical analysis gives you a sense of how very specific variables explain different levels of adaptation. Some of the factors that are statistically significantly associated with variations across households are recent exposure to hazards, asset ownership, diversity of information sources, and degree of organizational access for households. And the more people have of these, the more likely they are to have higher levels of adaptation. In contrast, a number of other variables that have been cited in the literature and which we included in the analysis turned out not to be statistically significantly related to adaptation strategies used by households. This concludes the first part of the analysis, first part of the presentation, and I fear Robin is going to show me another card very soon. So instead of trying to go through everything that I have, I will rather give you just a sense of the analytical lessons that are part of the second part of the presentation, and go there somewhat quickly. Yeah. So the analytical lessons that we derive from our work is that, one, household characteristics are often more important determinants of vulnerability than exposure. Two, existing adaptations often help reduce vulnerability but are insufficient. And finally, group-specific targeting of interventions should be based on characteristics of households rather than levels of vulnerability. Our analytical lessons related to institutions and organizational analysis suggest that stronger and longer-lived organizations and more comprehensive organizational coverage is associated with improved adaptations by households and communities. Second, coordination among organizations at the same level and between higher and lower levels is associated with more effective adaptation. And yet, in all studied countries, organizations have limited resources and capacity, markets are underdeveloped, and there are few incentives that local populations have for innovations. And the key implications of these are, one, preventive adaptation interventions are a must for households and communities that do not view themselves as having high exposure but still have high sensitivity. So those communities which have high exposure and low sensitivity often have substantial institutional access or organizational access, but not communities that have high sensitivity. Second, integrating across scales and sectors in pursuing adaptation options is critically important. And yet, addressing these obstacles must happen specifically, because rhetorical calls for cross-scale, cross-sectoral integration are much less useful. And finally, households are often able to cope well, but very, very often very close to subsistence levels, even those who are supposedly better off in the kinds of contexts that we were carrying out our studies. changes in long-term variability and ranges of long-term averages and ranges of variability in climate impacts, thus are likely to sink many of these households into complete destitution. So disaster-related safety nets are critical for supporting the adaptations of households. Finally, our analysis focuses primarily on behavioral adaptations, and their limits mean that complementary investments in hard adaptation options remain critical in many situations. And finally, this is where you can find more work on this subject and based on these projects. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Arun. Sorry to have to cut you off, but you knew the ground rules. Okay, so we're going to move quickly along now. Next up is Antonio Oviedo, who is a program officer with the World Wildlife Fund in Brazil, Amazon program. He's been working with community-based management of fisheries over the last 10 years. His work deals with capacity building and organizational development of common pool resource management in the Amazon floodplain. Antonio.
Well, morning, folks. 10 minutes, I give some approaches and reflections with a small and simple field project, a 7-year project in a partnership between an NGO, state government, municipal government, and grassroots organization. Project is located in the Amazon headwaters, mainly in the Purus and Juruá River, which is a very high level of conservation, important environmental services that model the Amazonas and Solimões main channel, and a mosaic of traditional communities and indigenous people. This region, mainly Acre state, is a small state in the Amazon region, but people there used to say things that everybody's dreaming, they are doing in practice. We run a climate witness approach in 2 sites, 2 fishery communities in Manuel Urbano and Feijó municipalities. We work and map some climate change perceptions based on oral narratives from fisheries. They are recording huge change of patterns since 2005, such as a shorter rainy season, shorter flooded season, drought, and a shift of the main species they used to manage, which is a pirarucu. Based on this work, people start designing some management schemes, adaptation options, and based on we call collective fishing agreements. During this process, there are 3 sets of factors which are influencing the design of management schemes. The first one is culture, on how to understand the process that mediate perceptions of climate and ecosystem change, and the menu of responses. One feature of floodplain culture is the way that this community live in the very present day, or the presentism. In floodplain communities, the future is a near future, it's tomorrow. There's a huge dynamic of the landscapes, and they used to say that everything is beginning over again, day by day. The fishermen do not say how the rains will be, but how the rains are. And also compare it to upland communities where you have a more stable landscape. You can accumulate and building things. This is a very different approach and understanding about adaptive capacity and understanding about adaptation. So culture is a very important issue for government to deal with these communities. The second one is information and production and dissemination of biodiversity and climate information and models to regional and community levels. You know, most environmental perceptions it's in the local scale, and achieving link between local and global understanding of climate information requires a connection within a broad network of information, and also a trust that this information of both levels are credible. When this connection exists, the adaptation is likely to be more easier. And management scheme must grasp this complexity of this kind of socio-ecological system. And the third one is institutions and principles that must be designed for the collective actions. The most challenge on management schemes is not on technology but organization, on how to put multi-level institutions working together and sharing information in a suitable language. And also communities really want more government participation, not less, but they want government supporting their own rules. The process we run, it's based on capacity building and community organization for developing the collective fishing agreements. We designed some participatory monitoring systems, some social learning procedures in order to communities and state government adapting and revising these fishing rules. And with the process is going on, with the improvement of collecting data and engagement of communities is helping state government on formulating some public policies, such as in the case of Acre, this work helps the government to create a state legislation for fisheries, a state legislation for river basin management, and a recent legislation on payment for environmental services. This is the pirarucu species. It's one of the biggest fish, freshwater fish. This is around 2 meters 80 and around 250 kilograms. This project is increasing around 120% of the productivity in a lake unit. Project start working in one floodplain lake and expand for 13 lakes, and the familiar income in 5 years increased 260%. Also, the process was since the beginning. It's very important to engage and to have the participation of the state government and also the federal government, which is regulate and approve the management plans, giving licensing, something like that. The social learning plays a key role in enhancing the adaptive management, and it's very important in regions where you have limited information. The main attributes of this process include building of shared perceptions, building of trust as a base for self-reflection, recognition of mutual dependencies and interactions, and engagement in collective actions and decisions. And finally, an important issue on building a multi-scale arrangement is that, for example, on fisheries, for pirarucu, for example, you do not have an only one big one stock or population of pirarucu. You have many micro stocks along the Amazon. So how address the research and management needs of so many micro stocks? And the answer is the barefoot managers, which is an approach proposed by Jeremy Prince, which is based on the Chinese barefoot doctors, where we train local groups with a low cost and generic expertise, facilitating implementing on monitoring and long-term collection data and supporting more regional and state and federal monitoring systems. Also, the barefoot managers helps to better define the roles and responsibilities of the government and research institutes, such as providing legal framework and developing techniques and toolkits to train these local groups. Well, that's it, man. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Antonio. Thanks for keeping so well to time as well. We're going to move straight along now to our third presenter, Dr. Jessica Ayers, who's a researcher in the climate change group at IIED, and she works on adaptation finance, planning and delivery. She recently completed her PhD at the London School of Economics in the governance of climate change adaptation. And her work has focused on the politics of local inclusion in adaptation planning, drawing on case studies from Bangladesh and Nepal. Over to you, Jess.
Thanks, Robin, for quite a lengthy introduction. But thanks. The title of my presentation is Addressing the Messy Miso. What is the role of local institutions in scaling up local adaptation? The work that I'm presenting this morning builds on a theme that we're
Jess,
working on.
you might need to go a bit closer to the mic, I think.
Sorry, is that better? Yeah. The work that I'm presenting this morning builds on one of the themes that we are focusing on in the climate change group of IIED, so it's very much a team effort, this presentation. And the case study that I'm presenting is, again, a collaboration between a large number of organisations in Nepal, who I will acknowledge along the way. So the outline of my presentation, first, very briefly, why do we need to focus on institutions? What's the role of institutions in CBA? And what's their role in scaling up? I'm going to be quite short on this because a lot of it's already covered in the presentation yesterday, the session on institutions yesterday, Aaron's presentation this morning, and some of the other presentations to follow. I'm then going to look at from theory to practice, how we're actually taking these concepts forward in local adaptation planning in Nepal. So firstly, the role of institutions in community-based adaptation. Community-based adaptation itself is a long-term process undertaken by vulnerable people, vulnerable communities in response to climate change and other risks. The way that people adapt and the capacity they have to adapt is institutionally defined, it's institutionally determined, and the choices that they make are also institutionally defined. I think, as Aaron pointed out quite well this morning. Our interventions, our CBA projects, the work that we're doing to support those communities, are the implementation modality for us to support that longer term process. So if we want our CBA interventions to be effective, we want to support that longer term planning process and the decision making that's being undertaken by vulnerable communities. And that means it's important for us to understand their constraints and the enabling factors that would enable our interventions to really be successful on the ground. So we need to look at excuse me, not only the climate risks, but the institutional conditions that enable people to respond to those risks effectively. But what about in scaling up? Moving beyond community-based adaptation is not just replicating it outwards. We really need to get it into policies, institutions, on budgets if we want it to be effective in the long term. And that means having compatible adaptation planning across scales, and community-based adaptation that's also supported by wider development planning. So these four diagrams show a very crude simplification of some of the ways in which these different planning scales can interact. The top-down arrows show top-down approaches to planning, and the bottom-up arrows, the idea that community-based adaptation is a bottom-up process that should feed up. The first diagram looks at a supportive interface, so higher-level planned adaptation is consistent with local-level adaptation. In an ideal situation, we think about nested institutions. So, for example, in Nepal, there's a fantastic community-based forestry user group network of community-based organizations that do a lot of great work at the community level. But they're legally recognized. A lot of sectoral planning goes through them. All the forestry sector work, when it's implemented at the ground level, most of it goes through community-based forestry user groups, and the information from these user groups feeds up into sectoral planning. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that, but the idea is that these institutions are nested and they support one another in information flow and resources. The second diagram shows planned adaptation supporting local adaptation at a crucial point. So that's not just planned adaptation, but development interventions as well. So, for example, social protection might enable your community-based adaptation to take place, to really take off. It's not exactly targeting community-based adaptation, but creating enabling environments. And the last two diagrams here are unsupportive interfaces. So either your planned adaptation and your community-based adaptation are completely missing each other, which is a real shame and a missed opportunity, or your planned adaptation is actually undermining your community-based adaptation. I think we're seeing this in a lot of NAPAs now, where we're getting large-scale infrastructure projects, for example, coming out of NAPAs that serve to actually displace a lot of vulnerable people on the ground that community-based organizations are trying to work with. So moving on to how we can try and operationalize these concepts. Local adaptation plans in Nepal is an approach to community-based adaptation, but it's not an approach to projects. It sees community-based adaptation as a process undertaken by communities that needs to be supported by these wider institutional environments. So in terms of what a LAPA actually is, it's a local adaptation plan of action, so it is that community-based adaptation plan, but it's also the mechanism for getting that planning into local and wider institutional frameworks. Fundamental to the LAPA approach is institutional analysis as a starting point for community-based adaptation planning. You need to identify which institutions are undermining the adaptive capacity at the local level, which institutional structures need to be addressed in your community-based adaptation plan, but then you need to look at which institutions you actually need to target and get into if you're going to have this information feeding up into policy and planning processes at larger scales. So just briefly, the LAPA work has just finished a pilot phase, which has been going on for 9 months. We've been working with 7 NGOs, some of whom are in the room today, which is great, in 12 pilot districts. And those NGOs are British Nepal Medical Trust, Rupantaran, RIMS, RSDC, ISET Nepal, Leebird, and NEWA. We've just come to the end of this pilot phase, and some of the initial learnings that are coming out have been really interesting, actually. One of the key things that we've done is trying to sort of cluster the institutional learning. And again, this is a gross oversimplification of what's come out of the pilot reports. And if you're interested in the complexities of this, I really encourage you to take a look at the pilot reports that are coming out this week. But in terms of roles of different institutions in enabling and facilitating adaptation, the community-based organizations were seen to be the best level for actually preparing and implementing community-level plans. In terms of civic institutions, NGOs were very well matched to sensitizing and mobilizing community groups around climate change adaptation. They were very good for developing capacity to prepare and implement adaptation plans. And we actually found a good role for cooperatives in mobilizing resources at the local level to sustainably fund some of these adaptation priorities that didn't need to be taken up into higher level planning systems. And public institutions are needed to integrate community plans into broader development and climate change planning, to coordinate the planning process, and to draw down on the resources that are flowing in at the moment for adaptation planning and for development. We then looked at entry points, so how do we get our plans, our local plans, into these institutions? And at the village scale, we identified sectoral and integrated plan formulation committees. So this is where the decision-making at the village scale actually takes place. Also engaged in village-level decision-making were citizen forums, which are actually quite inclusive forums, but not as inclusive of the most vulnerable groups as we would like to see. And thirdly, the government of Nepal has implemented a social mobilization program which actively targets socially marginalized groups. So that for us was quite a good entry point to get the priorities of the most vulnerable into village-level decision-making. At the district scale, the priorities that can't be taken forward at the village-level scale can be aggregated and brought forward to district-level planners through district-level stakeholder meetings, similar plan formulation committees that are comparable with those at the village-level scale. And these proposals are then pulled together at district-level scale, they go into a district plan, and that goes forward to the district council for approval. Again, some of those priorities can be taken up at the district level, and others then go forward to recommendations for national planning. Adaptation at the national scale is undertaken through formal national adaptation planning. In Nepal, that's based around the thematic working groups of the NAPA, and district-level council recommendations need to feed into that. So just going back to this slide, in terms of this sort of operational scale for the LAPA, it was really the village level and the district level scales which were the most appropriate administrative scales for the LAPA to sit. So at the village level, it's the most responsive to local communities, but the district level scale is really where top-down planning kind of stops, which is where the funding comes down to. So the important interface that we needed to focus on was that between village level and district level. This is my final slide, and just to think about some of the challenges that we face. The first one was obviously the capacity of local institutions, particularly in Nepal, where the security issues are incredibly complex at the local scale. A lot of formal governance systems don't actually operate. But the point of the LAPA process is not to predefine your institutions, not to say you're definitely going to work with formal governance. If it doesn't work, see which other governance systems are operating and see how you can work with them. Enabling inclusion of the most vulnerable and marginalized, a lack of cohesiveness within the community, which Robin already mentioned this morning, and finally the politics of aggregation, whose priorities are feeding up and why, and that's something that you need to pay quite close attention to. That's all I've got time for before I'm cut off, but if anyone wants any further information on this, the outputs of the pilot phase are being published this week. So come and give me your cards and I'll make sure that you receive those outputs. And the next phase is about to start, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Jess. Before we go on to the next and the final two speakers, let's just briefly recap where we are. In terms of scales, Arun started off with a sort of global, or at least an international perspective, with cross-country comparisons of some of the dynamics of adaptation, but also at the same time looking at the granularity of adaptation practices both within and across communities. So we're sort of zooming both up and down. We then moved to Antonio Oviedo, who brought us to the landscape or the ecosystem level. But again, what was critical in helping facilitate social learning for resource management and adaptation in that context was really this meso level, the role of barefoot managers at a meso level, if you like, higher than the landscape or ecosystem level. And then in the presentation we've just heard from Jess, again, the critical importance of the meso level, this intermediate level as an interface between communities and higher levels of government, critical for adaptation planning and facilitation. So we have two more speakers, and then we have two discussants who will briefly reflect on what we've heard. Our next speaker, very pleased to introduce Margaret Barihai. She's the National Program Coordinator of the Africa Climate Change Resilience Alliance in Uganda, Accra. Her work focuses on research and learning on communities' ability to adapt to climate change and capacity building of government institutions to plan and respond effectively to the impact of climate change. Margaret, over to you.
Thank you, Robin. Morning, everyone. They have already introduced me. So I'm glad to share with you a piece of work which has been done in Uganda, initiated by Accra, Uganda. And I know you've already known what Accra is all about. This is a consortium of Oxfam, Save the Children, World Vision, who else? Care International and ODI. But in Uganda, World Vision is taking lead. So the work I'm going to share with you is Accra has initiated a process which is trying to connect or to bridge the connections of different levels, communities, districts, and national levels, on how to enhance community adaptive capacity. And we are looking at how the national policies, which are relating to disaster risk reduction and climate change, and basically that is the NAPA, on how they can be implemented across the different scales to improve the adaptive capacity of communities. We've done this. Accra has done research at community level using our adaptive capacity framework, which we shared with you yesterday, those who listened to John Lindsay from ODI. And we have also done a second component of district capacity gap analysis. So those two findings, the community views and the capacity gap findings from the local level, are the ones we are using to see how best the community adaptive capacity can be enhanced. So today I'm sharing with you part of the capacity gap analysis. We held a larger district stakeholder workshop where we shared the findings, and we ended up coming up with the action plan and priorities on how to work with the district level, at the district level, to enhance the capacity. And this one, we involved the central government, the private sector available in the district, all technical heads of the district and the leaders, and also NGOs that were available. And in this room, we also have one of the representatives whom you will see in my presentation, and I will ask him to raise his hand so that you can have further interactions. Those who don't know where Uganda is, you can see it, and I'm taking you further to further western Uganda. That's where Bundubujo is. It's about 350 kilometers from the capital city. So basically, what Accra does, we have two major components. We have research and learning, which I've just explained, and that's where we develop our capacity building and advocacy work. But our main goal is to get this evidence to inform the humanitarian and development actors, and of course including government, on how they can refocus their work to improve the communities, the poor communities' ability to adapt to the climate variability changes and hazards. My presentation is going just to take you through what we mean by the capacity gap analysis, what was done, what came out, and I will give you highlights on the action plan that we have set to start the work. Basically, I want to share with you this process because we are taking it important. If it works well, it could be replicated somewhere else in other local governments. We started with developing the terms of reference, and together with the central government, what are we going to look for? And then we selected which district can be the best to give good results, and this is Bundubujo. And then we did the study. Accra supported an external consultant to do the study, and the central government has nominated 3 key staff, including the meteorology person, and adaptation person who is with us here today, and also the disaster officer to work with Accra to spearhead the capacity building activities in the country. And right now, where I have put the arrow is the action plan, which I'm sharing with you, which will be spearheading the capacity building activities in this district. So what I'm going to present to you is what happened in that workshop where we were doing data validation. And then from here, we shall be doing implementation. So basically, the main goal of this study, we were assessing the strengths, challenges, and future needs or requirements of this district on how they will be able to implement disaster preparedness management policy. It is still in draft form, but it has been running and implementation has been taking place. And the NAPA, this is the National Adaptation Programs of Action, which has been on since 2007. So that was the study, and our report is ready with all the recommendations. So I want to show you the feelings of one of the national staff during this, this workshop, to show you how he felt the relevance of the workshop.
Analysis. And secondly, to engage the different stakeholders to come up with an action plan. A lot of things that they have mentioned in their action plan, including maybe training, trying to integrate into development plans. That is actually what is a key to adaptation. And they still have a chance to integrate some of these issues into their budgeting process.
Yeah, that is Mr. Dibo. If you are in this room, you can raise your hand and people see you for further interactions. He's there, right behind there. So why we chose Bundubujo? Bundubujo is one of the most vulnerable districts in the country, one of the 54 disaster-prone. And it's, as you saw it in further west, it's geographically marginalized and underdeveloped. I just put some statistics which I may not go through in detail, but you can see I was trying to compare Bundubujo and national in terms of poverty levels. Bundubujo, you can see it is almost doubling the national level of poverty levels. You can see the mortality rates of children under 5 age, access to safe water, literacy and HIV, and generally this is an underdeveloped and vulnerable district. I don't need to go to details because I know time is going to be against me. And then when you look at climate variability, findings are actually showing how changes are taking place, like all what we've been discussing. Originally, Bundubujo used to face some of these things like landslides and mudslides in 30 to 50 years, but now they are experiencing it every year. So there is a lot of changes and fears. And of course, there are other factors like high population, deforestation, and poverty, as we have already discussed. So this study found that actually some things are taking place, like government is trying to do some work. It has introduced EcoSan toilet, like you see that photo. Although the adaptation of this, adoption of this toilet is still a question mark, because it's the technology is like against the tradition, the culture of the people. They are wondering this technology which separates urine and feces. So it's not yet, there is tree planting going on. There are many partners in the district doing a lot of work from these pictures. And what I want to highlight is like cocoa, and cocoa intervention is being supported by private sector. And some NGOs like Oxfam is supporting. So I take you to key findings that came out of this study. Oh my God. The cursor is failing to come.
Still poor coordination and collaboration within the district and other players. There was still inadequate district planning capacity. They have inadequate central government support, where the district does not get sufficient funds to carry out disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation activities. The district didn't have a system for the early warning and preparedness.
Department of Meteorology, we give out several products which can help districts to plan. I think once the information is given, it remains at the center. They don't normally tend to give it down.
We are aware there's a gap between the information that the Office of Disaster Management has and the information that the community has.
I think people have not been taking it as a serious issue. That's why it is not featuring in our plans.
So you can see issues are already being known down there. And in summary, we got 11 key gaps. I'm not going to go into details, but at least you've had a summary of the key problems. Maybe on and each of those gaps we managed to get recommendations. But I'm not going to go through the details. But generally, when you look at all of them, there is one cross-cutting problem which we found that we base on that to make the action plan. I don't know why the cursor is. So the head of the district summarized.
Possibly we have to call the people who assist us at the local level in planning, in collecting the priorities. We talk to them, we tell them the need for them to also focus on climate change. For us, it's a matter of having it as a priority. Then we can sell our plans to the people who can help us, and what can be within our means, we can cover.
So basically, that was almost overall kind of overarching problem as far as the issues around why communities' adaptive capacity is not being addressed. And from there, we developed key entry points for ACRA or other players, including civil society organizations, other NGOs. The key problem is looking at planning, coordination, and how the center can support. And we developed an action plan in terms of immediate, short-term, and long-term. In short-term, to summarize there, the district is requesting ACRA research, which already has community views, and already now we have capacity gap analysis findings. How can we support them? They are now in planning session. How can we support them? They include it now in their plan as the first time. And then we get the central government on board to support them technically right now So mainly, and the meteorology department is a key here. They said, how do we plan when we don't know what is going to happen in the next 10 years? So we are going to support, to work with these key institutions to help them plan better in this season. We have also long term. I may not go in details, but one of the things we are going to do is to use this model of a mainstreamed plan for the first time to see how best the local government can influence national prioritization of DRR and climate change so that they are able to scale up in other districts. Thank you very much. Our report is going to be read and will be put on our website for you people to read, because I couldn't be able to summarize in 10 minutes. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Margaret. So we've been sticking here with the MISO level, this perspective at the district level, but looking both downwards to communities and upwards to national planning frameworks and capacity building. We're going to move to our last presenter now, Adeline Aubry from Switzerland. She's based at the UNDP Regional Center in Dakar, Senegal, and she's the community-based adaptation specialist supporting 10 countries in the implementation of the global UNDP GEF community-based adaptation program, working in 10 countries, which she will tell us about right now. Adeline, over to you.
It's challenging to be the last speaker, and we already have 5 days behind us, and I can see some people falling asleep. Just stand up, please. Everybody stand up. Just few seconds. You stretch yourself. Straight on the side, on the other side, and shake the hands of your neighbor or give him a kiss. Nice. Okay, let's go for the last presentation. So, oh, it's already going. So I would like to share with you our experience in terms of building partnership at the local and national level to scale up our micro CBA project. Just to give you the context, I'm supporting the UNDP program on CBA, which is funded by GEF and implemented in 10 pilot countries in the world. It's implemented through the small grant program mechanism of GEF. It means that grants of up to $50,000 are directed to local CBOs and NGOs to design and implement their own community-based adaptation project. And the program is strongly supported by UNV, United Nations Volunteer, at the country level and as well as the global level through my person to strengthen the community mobilization, ensure that the participation is meaningful, inclusive, and that we strengthen the capacities of all the stakeholders. So where we stand now is that we have a portfolio of about 55 community-driven projects on the ground in these 10 different countries. A lot of other micro projects are emerging, and we would like to go beyond this micro project and participate to the local, regional, national, global dialogue, and to encourage a systemic change. Coming from this bottom-up approach. So how are we going? How have we started recently to do it? Through sharing widely our experience that we just acquired the past year. And we have a preference for the audio-visual mediums that we have spoken about the past days, participatory video, photo reports, which reach a maximum of people and are adapted to everybody. We strengthen the capacity building of all our stakeholders, strongly advocate, thanks to our concrete results in the ground and the projects to integrate CBA in local and national development planning. But today I would like to focus on another strategy which emerged from the field experience, especially in Morocco. It's to diversify and be very innovative and open to all the partnerships possible on the ground. And one case that I would like to focus on now is in Morocco. And where our partner community-based organization, Sidi Majber, is implementing a micro-CBA project. And this CBO is located in a national park. So the CBA project is aligned with the National Park Development Plan, which is an avenue to disseminate the lessons, to replicate it at the national park level. In this national park, there are 42 villages and 82 in the periphery. So all these villages are getting inspired by this CBO and in the national park. In the national park, there are also youth environment club. So it's also an avenue to reach a lot of students and teachers and sensitize them to CBA, and which can become part of their training. This national park is managed, administrated by the Regional Directorate of Water and Forest. And we work very closely with the Ministry of Water and Forest. They give a lot of technical support to the CBA. And they also learn from the projects that we are implementing together, learning by doing. And they are very keen to disseminate the lessons in the whole national park, but also in the other national parks of Morocco, because Morocco is a very centralized government state, so the lessons can very easily be shared to the national level and to the other national parks. And in these parks, German Technical Corporation, the former GTZ, is GIZ now, have been working for a long time, and they support our CBA in terms of technical expertise. And for them, it's also, this CBA project is also a learning experience, and they mainstream the lessons in their the adaptation program, a large adaptation program that they are currently developing. So. And in this, we work very closely with the local government. They have been included in the forum, consultation, discussion from the very beginning, the design phase. And they are currently, like all the local government in Morocco, they are currently requested to write a local development plan. It's the first time that this exercise is done in Morocco, and it's funded by the government. And just 1 week ago, they had their first local consultation forum to develop this local plan, and our CBO advocated a lot for CBA thanks to the experience in the field and what they learned through the project, and they succeed to mainstream CBA in the local development plan. And it was done through a forum where there were many actors who have been sensitized for the first time to CBA. In these parks, there are also US Peace Corps volunteers who are active, who have been active for a long time in this park and who are highly appreciated for the hands-on support they give to the communities. We also partner with them they gain a lot of experience, and they got very excited by CBA. It was their first experience. So now CBA is included in the induction training of all the US Peace Corps volunteers in Morocco. And they are strongly advocating to the headquarters in Washington, then CBA is in all the induction training. And they are themselves now developing some new CBA project on the ground with communities. So it's just amazing how from a tiny little CBA project, community-driven of $50,000, a little grant, how many actors are inspired, and the dynamics which is coming from this micro-project, thanks to the openness and the willing to work all together. And it's like a domino effect, and it's not horizontal or vertical dissemination. It's like going in all sense. It's very exponential, and it's like being in the same boat, as said Pablo yesterday. And we enjoy a lot, as Bettina advised us yesterday, that and the partnership with all these actors are very smooth, all supporting a local CBO. Just to inform you, because we don't have enough time, in Morocco we also have all the CBA projects, and which are aligned with a bigger governmental program to develop the oasis. So Then another example from Niger, where we have 7 local NGOs implementing a CBA project, and we really advocated that they work together, that they network, and they are not in competition, that they complement each other and build together their capacity to be stronger for advocacy, visibility, and it works again because they could influence the local authorities. CBA is now included in some development plan. We invite the regional authorities, traditional one, national one, to do exposure visits and to get to know CBA. And I think it's the best way to advocate. We started to have concrete results on the ground, and then now it's going very quickly. I think an exposure visit and speaking directly with farmers or pastoralists is worth tens of discourse at the national level and workshop and etc. So we don't have a lot of time. I have to stop. So just to tell you that all this advocacy works is inviting people to go to the field, to see, to discuss directly with farmers, pastoralists, fishermen, etc. Resulted in the establishment of local adaptation committees where all stakeholders are present. And it has been covered largely by the media, TV at the national level, and all our experience and lessons are feeding some bigger plan, government program. So from projects of $50,000, we are influencing a larger scale program of $2 billion, etc. And I don't have enough time, but in Namibia, somebody said yesterday that scaling up is very contextual, and I fully agree with this, and our teams have been very creative on how to scale up our project. And in Namibia, the president has just paid a 2-hour visit with the CBA. You can see him on the picture. And the prime minister also visited our project several times, and now is strongly advocating at the National Assembly. In Jamaica, we partner with an academic group which is gathering all the lessons, the practice, the approach, the new reasoning, and feeding the 5th assessment report for the IPCC. In Samoa, all our projects are aligned with the bigger plan also. So it's the last slide. It's just to tell you that for the moment, with our field experience, the best ambassadors for us to scale up the CBA have been the more than 6,000 community volunteers with whom we have worked, and the 60 local NGOs, CBOs, who are disseminating their knowledge, voluntary disseminating their knowledge with all the neighboring communities, village, but also up with the authorities. And that's all. If you want to know more about, because the time is very short, our coordinator is Charles Nyandiga. He must be here around. I cannot see him. Yeah, he is. And as I couldn't explain you more about the Niger case and Morocco case, we have also our 2 country teams here, Anne France from Morocco and Katiela from Niger on the back. So during the field visit, we have already shared a lot with Oxfam, CARE, FAO, etc., and we are at disposal to continue this sharing for the next 2 days. So please get in contact with us. Thank you.
Okay, Adeline, thank you very much. Now, we've thrown an awful lot at you this morning so far, and we're getting there. We're going to get to the discussion in just a few minutes. But first, we have, to help us with that, we have 2 discussants. The first is another Margaret, Margaret Arnold, my colleague, who is a senior social development specialist in the social development department, also working on the social dimensions of climate change. She's been at the World Bank for more than 15 years and is one of the 2 people who started up the bank's work on natural disaster risk management. She's also a co-founder of the Provention Consortium, a multi-stakeholder partnership focused on integrating DRR into development, and headed its secretariat in Geneva from 2007 to 2009. So Margaret has 5 minutes, which is a tall order.
Thanks, Robin. I'll try to be less than 5 minutes so we can have more time to discuss. And first, just thank you to all the presenters because they were really rich presentations, and I really enjoyed them. And I think what we saw in all of them was the role of institutions in facilitating or hindering this flow of information, of resources, of people, and these all have big impacts on how people can and do adapt. And so I'll just throw out a couple of thoughts that came to my mind as I listened, relating to the theme of this conference, which is scaling up. And when we had a meeting the other day just to kind of organize our panel, and I think it was Arun posed the question of what do we scale up? And I think we do have this tendency to kind of look for the perfect project or the perfect model to replicate and scale up. But after hearing all the diversity of adaptation strategies in these presentations, I'm not so sure it's about what we scale up, but maybe just about creating the enabling environments so that this scaling up can happen in a more natural way. So if we have the onus or just kind of general principle of how all of our interventions and planned adaptation can support the autonomous, spontaneous adaptation that makes up poor communities' day-to-day lives, kind of that be our starting point, and then figuring out how to support that so that it happens more naturally. And I think that requires two things. We need to not just look at scaling up, but we need to look at scaling out. And by that I mean kind of intersectorally, intergovernmentally, multi-stakeholder, because many times I think the solutions for adaptation are going to come from outside what we would think of the adaptation sector or disaster risk management sector. So in a lot of the I think in the field visits and things, you heard people saying, well, actually what we need is secure land tenure so that we can do things that would build our resilience, or we need clean water or something. So these solutions are not going to come from just the environment sector or whatever, what have you. And then second, I think we also really need to think about scaling down, and this was mentioned already, and I think in a couple of panels. So national policies need to provide meaningful adaptation frameworks at subnational and local levels in order to provide communities with usable information on risks, both in the short and long term, provide them with cost-effective adaptation measures, modalities to spread risk, and again, facilitate the autonomous process. So that needs to happen at a central level. At the local government level, it may mean outreach and capacity building to help subnational and local governments work with poor communities. Some local governments don't want to work with poor communities, and we need to provide outreach to those. Some want to, but just don't know how to, so there's a capacity issue there. It also may mean in the decentralization process, making sure that resources, adequate resources, are transferred with the responsibilities that go with decentralization processes. And then at the community level, again, it means formalizing the role of communities, and we saw in some of the presentations kind of including community-based adaptation in community development plans, so recognizing their role and formalizing that role so that there is this flow across scales. And maybe just to give an example of this kind of vertical scale linkages, I'll give you an example of a project we're working on in Mexico, which is a large project on strengthening social resilience to climate risk. And it has different components, and at the national level, it includes strengthening social resilience through long-term adaptation planning, and that's looking at how to support citizen participation in the formulation of national adaptation policy. So the central government has formed a consultative council with civil society to get citizen participation in the national adaptation policy. It includes exercises to identify and prioritize kind of where they need to focus on in terms of investments. It supports municipal adaptation planning and state level adaptation planning. And then there's specific components on disaster risk management, expanding financing for disaster risk management to all municipalities, looking at their social protection programs. So for example, for their public employment, using those works to do works on vulnerability reduction. It's about harmonizing ecological and territorial planning and promoting urban development policies, sustainable urban development policies that focus more on inner city development and densification. So there's a lot of, so it's again this intersectoral kind of scaling out, and there's encouraging this vertical integration as well. So those are my thoughts, and I'll stop there now and maybe pass the word to Ivan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Margaret. And now, finally, some thoughts from Dr. Ivan Bio, who heads the Climate Change and Environment Research Team in the UK Department for International Development, DFID. Ivan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Robin. And thanks for giving me the last word. It's always fun to have the last word. It doesn't happen very often in my own household, so I have to do this elsewhere. You're all the unwitty victims of this. I thought that in sharing some thoughts with you this morning, I wouldn't spend too much time on summarizing what has been done very well by my colleagues here on the role of local institutions and on scaling up, but rather to ask the question, why is it that we need those higher levels of organization in human society, and what it is and where it is that they can add value. And I'm going to do this on the basis of a number of observations I've made while visiting sites in Bangladesh, participating in this conference, but also in the CBA conferences in 2007 and in 2009, and also some other observations I've made while visiting other parts of the world and visiting other adaptation projects in the field. And I have 4 observations which I'd like to share with you, and then I'd like to very quickly summarize in terms of what I set out to do. And the first observation that I made when visiting all these community-based projects was that indeed it's quite fascinating to see how those local community-based adaptation processes really are starting to tackle some of these vulnerabilities of these communities to local threats, and to existing climate threats and to current climate shocks and a slowly changing climate. And in doing that, they build on this accumulated knowledge of CBNRM, or community-based natural resource management, and CBF, community-based forestry, and they do this very well. And they're actually CBA has become quite a welcome new friend in this paradigm of development, which is grassroots based, and it's quite compatible with the lessons that were learned since the 1980s in these areas. So that's my first observation, quite a very positive observation. The second observation that I've made is that while many of those projects really are dealing efficiently with the direct problems of very particular target groups in society, I've often been left wondering what happens to the kind of wider social environment and the wider economy. And referring back to the trip I did this year in the south of the country at the northern edges on the Sundarbans, we were looking at what was happening to poor communities in some of the polders, but I was wondering what was happening with the other players in society. What's happening to the traders up the line with whom poor people are trading? What's happening to the infrastructure? Who's looking after the infrastructure, which our poor communities need to communicate with the outside world? Who's looking after the ecosystem? Who is looking after the Sundarbans Is it CBA which is going to save the mangroves from whatever environmental threat is affecting it? So that was a kind of observation I made out there, which I thought was quite important and points to an important story. A third observation I made was that while most of these actions on the ground are very effective at dealing with immediate and current threats and trends, none of them really deal with the long term, and they're not able to do so. And some have asked in the field and also here in the conference, who's going to deal with when it doesn't work anymore? Who's going to take over when community-based action is insufficient to deal with the threats that are affecting local communities, either by climate change or by other processes? Are there thresholds beyond which it is not possible anymore to support the poor in our community through community-based action? And who's going to do that? And the last observation I made was that when I look back at all of those places where I've been and where I've seen local communities affected by a number of environmental threats and often climate-related threats, I was often left wondering what was it that caused their problems. Again, referring to the trip I did this year in the Khulna region, the northern edges of the Sundarbans, where we looked at problems of salinization and how this was affecting the livelihoods of poor communities. What is it that causes this? Is it because of this dam upriver that slows down river flow in the dry season? Or is it because of these richer farmers who are pumping seawater to do some shrimp farming? Or is it because of sea level rise? And if it's a combination of all of these things, which one is the one which is most important? And unless I know this, I wouldn't know actually where to start building long-term adaptation and long-term resilience. So these were some of the observations I made, which I thought I wanted to share with you because they are indicative of what I think might well be necessary actions at other levels rather than at the level of community-based adaptation. And I think there are three issues here which we need to be aware of. And the first one is, while it's important to make a special effort at helping local communities of poor people adapt to climate change, it wouldn't work if this were to happen in a vacuum and if at the same time the national economy isn't also made resilient to climate change. So we need a number of actions at other levels of organization that are going to help the rest of the economy become resilient to climate change as well. This is not the area of community-based adaptation. It is where government needs other tools and needs another dimension perhaps to effect change. Secondly, what are we going to do with the long term? What are we going to do with the limits to local adaptation? Who is responsible for that? And again, I'm afraid this will point to perhaps some limitations to what we can do at the level of the local community. And thirdly, are we sure that we are dealing with the right problem? And is it sufficient to have some light touch, superficial, participative action, research, science conducted at the local level? Or do we need some real hard science to probe down and to help us disentangle some of these very difficult questions that we need to deal with in order to identify where appropriate action really is required? So to conclude, I thought that in addition to scaling up and linking up from the community, from community action, we need a couple more things. And one of them is, I think we need scale appropriate action. It's not sufficient to work at the community and to eventually build up a patchwork quilt of community-based action that will lead to some kind of national resilient society. That doesn't work. That will never work. There are other things we need to do in order to make sure that we get a resilient economy So we need scale appropriate action. And the second thing we might need to do, in addition to linking up from the community, is actually to drill down from the community, from the local down to the physical and the political economy context within which these things happen, to get a good, proper, scientifically rigorous understanding of the environment in which we work, so that we can pinpoint the exact actions and the most effective actions that we can support. That was what I wanted to contribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bit of a marathon. We started 5 minutes late. We have 5 more minutes. I just want to, before we get to your questions, and we will have time for a round of questions, and I wanted to throw up 3 possible pathways, and I'm not going to go into any details, but if anyone wants to continue the discussion, we'll find a way to do that. These are possible pathways at the policy or national program level that may be useful, and which some examples have been given already here for scaling up community-based adaptation. The first is around sort of major national programs for community-driven development and social protection that are increasingly addressing climate resilience. These are a few examples here from Ethiopia, India, Mongolia. Margaret mentioned Mexico, where the World Bank is helping to support some of these things. A second is a theme which has been very strong throughout all these sessions on national action to support scaling up. And that's the notion of really empowering citizen engagement at national and subnational levels in adaptation planning. And linking to Ivan's point about the longer term, and also something which came up in the tools session yesterday, participatory scenario development is beginning to be used now as a way of bringing together community perspectives with the best available science that helps think about planning under conditions of uncertainty. There's copies of this report outside the room here, which is from a study in which we attempted to do this. And in Vietnam, for example, this is being used as a platform for adaptation planning now as part of a national level policy lending operation. And then finally, we talk a lot about adaptation in place, in situ. But I think just as important, and increasingly so over the longer term, is going to be thinking about ways of facilitating voluntary migration as a complementary strategy to adaptation in place. It's not an either-or thing. You can do both. Many households already do both and have been doing so for decades. In southern Rajasthan, for example, we have a new project just developed in Rajasthan, the Rural Livelihood Support Project, which includes in its climate resilience component some measures to try to promote voluntary, seasonal and circular wage labor migration, in addition to sort of landscape level and on-farm level measures to build resilience. Just while we have this round of questions, we're going to hand out some USB drives that have a number of our publications from the World Bank's Social Dimensions of Climate Change program. So if you can just grab one of these and just pass the box back, hopefully this should be enough for everybody. Now that's quite enough from all of us. Over to you. We have time, I think, for one round, and I'll take 2 from each panel, as it were, and our presenters will listen carefully and they'll have a chance to have just 1 word each. Okay, so I'm going to start here on the front row.
Okay, I'm Ali Hasnain from Pakistan. Thank you very much for your presentation and reflections. Special thanks to Adeline for waking us up. It's about time that we wake up, yeah? Thank you. Well, my question is directed towards Jess. Just when you were talking about challenges, about institutions and climate change, thank you. Don't you think that corruption is one of the biggest challenge? And I mean, why we are shying away from corruption? I mean, I think corruption is one of the biggest challenges to CBA. So that's my first part is directed towards you, and second part is directed towards World Bank. Robin, you are a multilateral institution, and you guys are working in all those countries that have been affected by climate change. And you would agree with me that they are highly affected by corruption. So at times I ask these multilateral people that why don't you intervene in corruption? Because I mean, the money that comes at national level hardly goes to the local level. And that's where we are advising solution. So the money hardly reaches there. Multilateral organizations come in and they can advise governments on raising utilities. But why not? Can't they say anything about corruption or checking it? Or do we have to accept it?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, gentleman in the middle with the red shirt.
I'm Harjeet from ActionAid International. Thank you very much for the presentations. I have a word of caution while we are talking of role of institutions at different scales. And I have been seeing that particularly on adaptation, we stop our analysis at the national level. I think we also have to keep an eye on the international institutions and the processes that are happening which can support or erode the adaptive capacity of people. There was an example on Burkina Faso. The cotton farmers of Burkina Faso are not able to get good price of their yield because of the internationally low prices of carbon due to the subsidies given by industrialized countries to their farmers. So how does that impact? Which means whatever gets decided at WTO will also have an impact on adaptive capacity of people. So we need to keep an eye on that. Similarly, how the food prices went up and what was the role of commodity speculation in the market exchanges, that is also very important to understand. And we also see a lot of international projects and processes which are promoting the genetically modified crops as the solution and adaptation mechanism, which we all know that is going to even undermine the capacity of farmers at the local level, particularly in the long run. So while a lot of focus needs to be there, national, subnational and local level, we should not ignore what's happening at the international level on adaptation.
Thank you, Harjeet. Extremely good point. Rachel, I think you had your hand up first in that side.
Thanks. Yeah, I had two sort of more comments. I think one first on Aaron's, the findings from the report that Aaron presented. The key finding that household characteristics determine vulnerability more than the exposure to hazards. I think this is a really important finding, but in terms of international implications, this is absolutely not what developing country governments are willing to hear. I've sat in Adaptation Fund board meetings where they're looking for somebody to tell them the scientific reasons why a country is vulnerable so that they can be top of the list for funding. And when they have been told by Christy Ebby from the IPCC that actually social characteristics and political issues determine vulnerability, they say, but these are too difficult, we can't prioritise. And this is going to be key. Countries don't want to address the fact that vulnerability is caused by their own actions or inactions. And that's an issue that somehow we working on adaptation have got to fight for. The other is at the other end of the scale. I mean, I'm interested to hear about the GEF pilot programme, really giving out quite small pots of money to relatively small organisations, and intrigued by the high level of engagement with actors at different scales. I think this is very valuable, but if we do scale up CBA, there's no possibility of that level of engagement being possible. So let's hope that those institutions that are engaging on the pilot programme will learn from that, but we can't expect that level of engagement when you scale up CBA. It just institutionally won't be feasible.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry that we're not going to be able to take any more questions, and we're just going to respond to those extremely good questions. Let me just start on the corruption question. I think you're absolutely right, and you will see if you take a look at some of these publications, a very strong theme in the work that we've done is the importance of social accountability mechanisms in framing climate action and in holding governments and local authorities and so on to account, and making sure that climate finance, development finance that's used for these purposes is in fact used for the intended purposes and in the intended ways. And so increasingly, projects are building in social accountability mechanisms, grievance redress mechanisms, and so forth to do exactly this. I'm very glad you raised this, but it really underscores the importance of broad-based platforms for citizen engagement in framing climate action at all levels, and continue to monitor, evaluate outcomes, and so forth. The importance of the social learning sort of processes that Antonio talked about. Now, on the second, Haji, excellent point. We shouldn't stop at the national level in thinking about scale. What about the global and the international? On this, I'd like to ask Ivan to give a response. Did you hear that, Ivan? Ivan used to be on the Adaptation Fund board, so that's why I'm asking him this. Ivan, the importance of the global and international, why do we stop at the national level in this discussion? Should we, and what's your response?
Right, okay, thank you. I was just telling Margaret, you know, why the hell is he talking? I mean, isn't he chairing this session? Shouldn't it? Anyway, I've said it.
Mea culpa.
No, not to worry. You say things much better than I usually do. Yes, I thought these were excellent questions, and both the first and the second one, I think, stress my point that there are other things that need to happen above to make, not only to make things at the community level possible, but also to actually make sure that it can be sustained. The corruption point was very powerful. I totally agree with the need to look up from national to global, and it's a point I wanted to make, but I thought I didn't have enough time. I think we have to ask ourselves the following questions, really. What is it do we need to do to help communities adapt to climate change? The second question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we need to do to make national economies resilient to climate change? And the third question we should dare ask ourselves, but haven't done so yet, I haven't seen much in the literature on this yet, is what do we need to do in order to make the global economy climate resilient? And if you ask that question and you start modeling the global economy, you do find some scary things. For instance, is it more important for us to help to ensure that the Australian breadbasket of the world is properly protected against climate change rather than the poor farmer in Mali? These are difficult questions we do need to ask ourselves at that kind of level. So I do agree that we have to look beyond the national level at the global level, and the point on the WTO is a strong and important point. On the Adaptation Fund, Rachel and I have talked about this very often, about this vulnerability question. I will agree with Rachel that indeed it is very important that you look at the right characteristic to make sure that vulnerabilities are properly described and identified, and the household level is probably a good one. But I think it's horses for courses. The discussion at the board of the Adaptation Fund have to do with allocation of large amounts of money from the international community to national entities. And it becomes rather complicated to bring in households in the discussions at that level. You need to start aggregating things, and I'm not sure that it would be easy to do so.
Thank you very much. Arun, I'm going to ask you to address Rachel's point. The question is, developing country governments would often far rather that we focus on the exposure aspects of vulnerability rather than looking at the arguably operationally more tractable questions around sensitivity and adaptive capacity. What's your response to this?
Thank you, Rachel. I think you highlight the distinction between the politics of knowledge and the analytics of the work that we do, and clearly the two don't often go together. I think in defense of developing countries, one might say also that our findings are based on what exists right now. We don't know what's likely to be the effect of exposure 30 years from now, and many developing countries might claim, perhaps cynically, that that is what they are most concerned about.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. If Salim is here, he has a couple of housekeeping... Jess?
Can I have a chance to respond to the question that was directed at me?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, of course.
Just quickly, I think I'll be very quick. It was a very important point that you made, and for us, when we do the initial institutional analysis, where institutions aren't functioning, where government institutions aren't functioning, or they perhaps don't even exist at the local level, you have to look for alternatives, and I agree with that. But I also think that when you're talking about corruption, corruption happens for a reason, and that's because there are perverse incentives in place that are driving that. And for us, if we're going to build towards this sort of longer term adaptation process, towards a sort of transformational change process of adaptation, we need to stop bypassing government systems and look at why they aren't working. And part of the LAPA programme tries to do exactly that. Which institutions are important, which ones are failing, why are they failing, what capacity needs to be built to enable them to function in the longer term. So I think it's a really important point, but something that it's important just not to write institutions off because you assume they're corrupt. I think it's important to look at why as well.
Thanks very much, Jess. So finally, if anyone didn't get a copy of one of these USB drives and wants one that has these publications and a number of others, come and find me, or we'll leave them on the tables outside. They're in brown boxes like this, little white boxes inside. Salim has a couple of housekeeping points, and then we go to coffee.
Thank you very much, Robin and the panel. Can I ask everybody to thank the panelists for a stimulating discussion? Thank you. I do have a couple of announcements, but I'm afraid I can't resist sharing an anecdote on the issue of corruption, especially since we have the World Bank chairing this. Many years ago, Atik and I were involved in submitting a proposal for a project that was funded by the World Bank here in Bangladesh. It was in the order of $1 million or so for a consultancy contract. And we were evaluated the best in terms of the technical evaluation. And then we got a call from the minister saying he'd like to invite us for a cup of tea. We went to see him, and he said, "You've got it if you give me 10%. And we said, "We're not going to be able to do that." And he said, "Otherwise, you're not going to get it." And we didn't get it. A month or so later, I was in Washington, and I met somebody from the bank's evaluation department or something that looks at things, and I told him this story. And he said, "That's great. Can you put it in writing?" I said, "Are you crazy? I have to go back home." So that's the bank, turning a blind eye to these things. They know it's happening. It's the lesser of two evils as far as they're concerned, and they live with it. But that was just a personal anecdote. I have a couple of announcements to make. The first one is to do with where are we going to hold the meeting next year? We have a number of candidate countries that have put themselves forward, or organizations from countries that have put themselves forward. We've had volunteers from Thailand and Vietnam already. If there are others, please let me know during the course of today. Tonight after dinner, we're going to be meeting with the organizing committee, and we will weigh the pros and cons of all the various proposals and try and come out with an announcement tomorrow in the closing session as to where the sixth conference is going to be. So if you want to volunteer your country, do come and let us know. What it means is that you then take responsibility for organizing it at your country level. So you doesn't have to be a single organization. You could have a multiplicity of organizations at the country level. And we'll give you a lot of support and information on how to organize it, but you do really need to take responsibility of the logistics and everything at the country level. Last year, as I said, we had it in Tanzania. The Tanzanians were really very, very good. They did a great job, even though it was fairly overwhelming for them to hold such a big conference. The other thing I wanted to share with you is about how we are going to do the proposed book, which we've spoken about several times. The procedure is the follows. We've asked each of the session leaders of those themes to act as the lead author for that chapter, and they very kindly agreed to do that. We've asked them to co-opt, or for volunteers to be co-authors of that chapter, and it's up to you if you want to be a volunteer or a co-author for a chapter. Please talk to the session leaders and do so. But as I mentioned earlier, volunteering does involve work. If you can't put in a lot of writing time yourself and you just want to be a reviewer, that's another option. You can tell them that I'm happy to review, but I can't put work in. But if you do wish to be a co-author, we will expect you to do work, and you are not automatically going to be a co-author unless you actually do deliver. So just volunteering does not get your name on as a co-author. That does require a fair degree of input, ultimately in the final product, to justify having your name as a co-author. And the final point I'd like to make on this is that very often people, practitioners, NGOs, have a lot of information, a lot of enthusiasm, want to participate, but writing a good scientific paper is not a skill that everybody has. Academics, on the other hand, have to write papers for a living, and they have the skills. So I'm appealing to the academics in the audience, and this time around we do have a substantial number of academic researchers, to please volunteer to be lead authors or substantial co-authors in the chapters, because you have the skills that we are going to need to write a significantly valid, credible, scientific output that we are hoping to achieve this time. So with those words, I'm going to let you go and get your tea and coffee, and then hopefully reconvene in half an hour's time. Thank you.